It is also a time of change for my family.
Behind a closed annex door at Buckingham Palace, in a room that smelled faintly of leather and old paper, Princess Anne signed her name at the bottom of a single sheet of vellum. There was no press outside. There were no senior staff flanking her chair. There were no cameras, no ceremony, no well-wishing foreign dignitaries. Just a brass desk lamp turned low, an ink pen that had been carried out of a velvet pouch with the cold precision of a medical instrument, and an older woman who had served the crown since childhood, drawing a line through a problem that had haunted the House of Windsor for nearly a decade. The order before her was not a parliamentary instrument. It was an internal royal directive, the kind that never reaches the public record, the kind that quietly rearranges the meaning of a family tree without ever saying so out loud. Anne read it once. She read it again. She did not pause to weep. She did not pause to smile. She signed it as though she had been waiting for permission to do it for years. Because she had. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the future of the royal family and the story behind Anne's quiet but devastating decision, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update. This is not gossip. This is not commentary. This is the slow-motion dismantling of a chapter that Britain had been told was already closed. What followed was not a speech. What followed was silence. And in that silence, a nation began to understand that the monarchy had finally stopped pretending. The document itself carried a name unfamiliar to most viewers, but recognizable to anyone who has studied how royal households operate behind the scenes. It was called an Instrument of Lineage Clarification, a private administrative act used only when the sovereign in council, advised by senior figures of the royal household, decides that the customary meaning of a member's place within the wider royal lineage requires correction. Lineage, in this sense, did not mean blood. It meant belonging. It meant the public-facing identity of who counts as part of the working royal narrative, who receives ceremonial precedence, whose children are formally acknowledged in official royal biographies, and whose name appears in the documents the rest of the world reads as the shape of the monarchy itself. Anne's signature did not erase Meghan Markle from history. It could not, of course, do that. What it did was far more surgical. It adjusted, in the quiet language of palace paperwork, the official standing of Meghan within the working future of the House of Windsor. From that moment, her name would appear in royal lineage summaries only as the wife of a prince who had stepped away from public duty, not as a member of the institution in her own right. Her children were already placed outside the working line of succession by an arrangement that had been quietly reached years earlier. But until Anne's order, there had still been a softening language in the official biographies, a polite hedging, a stubborn nostalgia, a refusal on the part of the palace's old guard to write the final period at the end of the sentence. Anne wrote that period, and she did so without the king's presence, without William's presence, without Catherine's presence, without Camilla's presence. In the quiet of her own hand, Anne did what the rest of the family could not bring themselves to do in public. She ended the ambiguity. The reaction inside the palace was not loud. It was the kind of silence that travels through marble corridors and settles outside closed doors. Charles was informed within the hour. He sat in the garden room at Clarence House with a cup of tea that had gone cold. He did not speak for several minutes. He had long understood that the Meghan question was one that could not be solved by affection, by patience, or by quiet diplomacy. He had tried, on more than one occasion, to keep a door open. He had spoken softly about his son. He had spoken warmly about his daughter-in-law, in unguarded moments in front of trusted staff. He had been counseled by advisors who warned him that an open door could become a wound. He had listened. He had understood, and yet he had hesitated. Anne did not hesitate. Camilla, who had been told the news next, accepted the order with the measured calm of a woman who had spent decades learning that the monarchy protects itself long before it protects individuals. She did not object. She did not celebrate. She simply nodded once and said, very quietly, that it was time. William received the news from his private secretary while traveling back from an engagement in the Midlands. He read the summary, closed the folder, and continued the journey. Catherine, told later that evening at Adelaide Cottage, said almost nothing. She had already explained to those closest to her that she did not believe the Sussex chapter could remain permanently unfinished. Her view, offered in private and never published, was simple and unforgiving. An institution cannot be half protected. A future cannot be half built. And a family cannot be half whole. But to understand why Anne moved now, why the signature came when it did, the story does not begin with the document. The story does not begin with Meghan. The story begins years earlier in a series of smaller wounds that accumulated into a verdict. The truth, as the palace insiders whispered even before the ink dried, was that Anne had been weighing this decision for almost 3 years. She had watched the slow erosion of trust between her brother and her nephew. She had watched Harry's public statements drift further from the language of a working royal. She had watched Meghan's complaints be aired in foreign television studios and glossy magazines with a precision that felt less like heartbreak and more like strategy. And she had watched, with the particular sorrow of an older sister, the slow disappearance of the brother she remembered. The Harry she knew had been duty-trained, soft-spoken, raised on the same ceremonial rhythms that Anne herself had been raised on. The Harry who emerged from California was not unrecognizable. He was simply no longer a Windsor in the way the institution required. The trigger that finally pushed Anne from deliberation to action was not a single insult. It was a pattern. It was, in the language of palace households, a series of breaches. A televised interview in which Meghan used the word institution as though it were a rival. A memoir in which private moments between senior royals were turned into courtroom evidence. A family occasion, the christening of a child not yet old enough to speak, that was staged for cameras in a way that felt more like a launch than a sacrament. And finally, a quiet but unmistakable gesture, the leaking of private correspondence to a sympathetic interviewer, that turned palace patience into a finite resource. Anne had watched each episode with the composure that the public knew her for. She had given no press conferences, she had issued no statements, but inside the household, she had begun to ask questions that senior advisors found difficult to answer. She had asked why the door remained open. She had asked why official biographies continued to soften the language. She had asked, with a sharpness that one official described as surgical, whether the Crown could afford to keep the chapter open indefinitely without paying a constitutional price. The answers she received only confirmed what she had already suspected. The private confrontation, when it came, was not between Anne and Harry. It was between Anne and Charles. And it did not happen in a palace drawing room. It happened in a small office at Gatcombe Park, on a wet Sunday afternoon, with no staff present and no records kept. Anne had invited her brother to her home in Gloucestershire. She had not framed the meeting as a request. Charles understood, even before arriving, what was being asked of him. He arrived alone. He did not bring Camilla. He did not bring his principal private secretary. He did not bring a constitutional advisor. Anne met him at the door, offered him tea, and walked with him into the long sitting room where she had once briefed ministers and honored veterans, and said her piece in fewer words than most people use to order lunch. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize the moment. She said plainly that the Crown could no longer be held hostage to the unresolved Sussex question. She said that the institution had asked far too much of too many people for far too long. She said, with a gentleness that her brother recognized as love, that by keeping the door open, the family was not protecting Harry. It was preventing William from becoming the king the country needed him to be. Charles listened. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. He did not defend Meghan. When his sister had finished, he sat in silence for several seconds, and then, in a voice that those present described as the smallest it had ever been, said that she was right. He then asked her to do what he did not have the heart to do himself. What followed was the quietest institutional process the modern monarchy has ever conducted. There was no Privy Council meeting, there was no televised address, there was no formal reading of the order. The instrument of lineage clarification was filed by Anne's private office with the keeper of the royal archives. A parallel note was lodged with the Lord Chamberlain's office, instructing household staff that official royal biographies, ceremonial programs, and guest lists for state occasions should no longer carry the Sussex line of descent in its previous form. Ceremonial precedence, in the old language of the court, is the order in which members of the royal family are processed, announced, and seated at official events. It is not a sentimental matter. It is a constitutional code. By adjusting it, even quietly, the household encoded a new reality into the choreography of monarchy. Succession, in the constitutional sense, refers to the legal order in which the crown passes from one sovereign to the next. It is distinct from lineage, which is the wider understanding of who belongs within the royal narrative. The instrument did not affect the legal order of succession. It affected the meaning of lineage itself. The palace lawyers moved with considerable care. They understood that any public framing would require sensitivity, particularly given the public sympathy that Meghan retained among a section of the British public. The official explanation, when it leaked, was deliberately understated. A royal household spokesperson, speaking on background, described the order as a routine housekeeping measure to ensure consistency between official documentation and the actual working practices of the royal family. That wording was, as several journalists observed, technically true. It was also profoundly misleading. There was nothing routine about it. The household had been quietly preparing the ground for this moment for at least 2 years, ever since the Sussexes had completed the formalities of their departure from working royal life. The decision to act now was Anne's alone. The decision to allow her to act alone was Charles's. The public leak, when it came, was not a leak in the traditional sense. It was not a stolen document. It was not a whistleblower. It was the slow accumulation of small corroborations from trusted insiders, each of whom confirmed a piece of the picture until journalists could confidently publish the shape of what had happened. Within hours of the first report, broadcasters interrupted regular programming. Newspapers that had spent months writing carefully balanced pieces about the Sussexes suddenly found themselves writing about the monarchy instead. Headlines spread across the country. Crowds did not gather outside the palace. There were no protests. There were no placards. But in living rooms and pubs and offices, Britons began to debate what the order actually meant. Some said it was overdue. Some said it was cruel. Some said it was constitutional common sense. Some said it was the cold, careful work of a family that had, after years of hesitation, finally prioritized the institution over sentimentality. The Sussex household, contacted through intermediaries, declined to comment. Harry, who had been informed of the order through a brief and formal communication from his father's principal private secretary, reportedly read the message, set it down, and asked not to be disturbed. There was no rage, there was no public statement, there was, according to those who spoke with him in the days that followed, a stillness. That stillness was not acceptance. It was, perhaps, the beginning of a private grief that would take years to understand. Meghan, likewise, did not respond publicly. A close friend suggested in an unattributed remark that she had always known this moment would come. The monarchy, that friend said, does not forget, it waits. The Windsors, the remark continued, are very good at waiting, and royal offices, the administrative machinery that surrounds the institution, are built not for speed, but for continuity. What had happened was not a punishment, it was a clarification. The country saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. Charles had made a decision that he would carry for the rest of his life. He had chosen the crown over his son. He had done so not as a cruelty, but as an act of protection. Protection of the institution he had been raised to serve. Protection of William, who had been preparing, throughout his adult life, for a kingship that could not tolerate ambiguity. Protection of Catherine, who had been asked, with growing frequency, to absorb the consequences of a wound she had not created. Protection of Anne, the elder sister who had grown tired of watching her family pretend. And protection of Harry himself, whose future could only be honored if the monarchy was still strong enough to be honored in return. Camilla had understood this earlier than most. She had said, in one of her quietest and most private moments, that the monarchy could survive many things, but not the permanent presence of a question it could not answer. She had said it in a tone that one person present described as the closest thing to relief the monarchy had produced in modern memory. The final symbolic moment arrived not in a broadcast studio or a palace courtyard, but in a small room at Sandringham. Charles and William met there, alone, in the days after the order had been processed. They did not speak about the document in formal terms. They did not refer to lineage in legal language. They spoke instead about preparation. William asked his father what he would need in the coming months. Charles told him that what he would need most was patience, and that patience, in the Windsor sense, was not passivity. It was the willingness to carry a difficult decision in silence every day without complaint. William nodded. He had already learned that lesson. The two men sat together then, for a few minutes, without speaking. Catherine, in a separate room at the house, wrote a single line in a private journal. The line, shared later with no one outside the family, was simple. She wrote that the crown had chosen preparation over farewell. That is the Windsor way. She closed the journal. She went downstairs. She joined her husband for a quiet evening that was, in its own way, the most historic moment of the day. Weeks later, at a small investiture at Windsor Castle, Princess Anne stood beside the king as he presented honors to a long list of recipients. She wore her usual composure. She used her usual economy of gesture. She moved through the ceremony with the same measured authority she had exercised since her youth. When the moment came for her to sign the next page of the official record, the camera caught her for barely a second. There was no drama. There was no flash. Just a woman whose duty had always been to the institution, whose future had just been quietly secured. And that moment, for those who understood what had come before, said everything. The family remained wounded. The family remained bound. The crown had chosen preparation over denial. Love and duty could no longer remain in the same form. The future had been acknowledged without ending the present. And somewhere, behind the closed doors and the polished phrases and the quiet choreography of royal life, Anne took a breath, closed the file, and stepped back into the ordinary rhythm of a life that had just changed the meaning of a dynasty. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.